Welcome to Why Knowledge Matters. Liz Jackson is Professor of International Education at the Education University of Hong Kong. She is also the former director of the Comparative Education Research Center and past president of the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia. Her recent books include Contesting Education and Identity in Hong Kong in 2021, Beyond Virtue, The Politics of Educating Emotions in 2020, Educational Assessment in Tanzania, A Sociocultural Perspective in 2020, and Questioning Allegiance, Resituating Civic Education in 2019. Welcome, Liz. It's really great to have you. Hope you're doing fine in Hong Kong.
Thank you. Yeah, things are good here in Hong Kong. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's really nice, and I really look forward for your talk. You will be talking about the philosophy of education, and I'm sure our viewers will be very excited to learn from you as a very, very highly established academic learning about the philosophy of education. So now, could you describe to us what philosophy of education is and what made you personally studying the philosophy of education, or the interest simply in the philosophy of education?
Sure. So philosophy of education is a field of study related to education and philosophy. That's probably the most obvious thing that someone would know. So most people think of education as a field related to training educators or school leaders, such as principals. So a lot of people don't understand that you can study education from a variety of ways, just like other social activities, biological phenomenon, and so on. So the ideas and the activities involved with schooling and learning can be studied from many different fields. You can study the history of education over time, the sociology of education and diversity, technology's role in education, and all sorts of different things like that. So in that context, philosophy of education is pursued, it's pursued differently by different thinkers, so it's hard to say what it is in a way that represents everybody. But what does unite philosophers of education is a focus on understanding ideas, perspectives, values, and other abstract concepts from a philosophical or theoretical light, primarily. So you might do research within schools, but you also think about these ideas more abstractly. So for myself, this has involved considering the values that are underneath the surface of schooling. So when we say that we want to educate young people to contribute to society through citizenship education or civic education, service learning, all of these things are very popular today. I'm very interested in thinking about what are the values and norms that are at play here. Do we want young people, in the case of citizenship education, do we want young people to think of themselves as citizens of Canada, United States, Hong Kong? If that's so, what does it mean to be from that place? On the other hand, maybe we want global citizens. So what does that look like in terms of the values and characteristics and cultural understandings? Often these things are actually assumed and taken for granted. So a lot of what philosophers of education do is think about what's taken for granted by other people involved in education. So as a philosopher of education, I look at data and evidence, which is things people say, what's in a policy document, what's in a textbook. I actually spend a lot of time looking at textbooks, and I analyze how different decisions, different social events, and different values come into the picture. And I look at it not just in terms of what does the data say, but what are the values. And I look at arguments about the way education should operate from a philosophical perspective. So that's the way that I focus on philosophy of education. Other philosophers of education might do things differently than me. So some might rely on a certain theoretical perspective, like liberalism, postmodernism, feminism. There's so many different sort of theories out there. So it doesn't have to be sort of pure philosophy, but there's a lot of theoretical perspectives that people might explore and then apply them to an educational problem or question. Other people might be interested in considering what a thinker from the past or even today would say about education. So what would Confucius have to say about education here in Hong Kong? What would John Dewey have to say, or other people you can think of from history? So you asked what made me interested in this topic or get into this field of study. So many people in philosophy of education find the field after working as a school teacher. For me, I was training to be a social studies teacher. So I was a university student when I discovered philosophy of education. So I wanted to be a teacher for very sort of moral and ethical reasons. I noticed that when I was in school, there was a lot of inequality that in academic jargon, I would say there was inequality that got reproduced in school. But what I mean by that is I remember that when I was in school, I saw that some of my peers, some of the other students had wealthy families, their parents helped them with their schoolwork. They were very well behaved in class and the teachers really liked them and were really nice to them. And then I saw that I also had some peers who were poor, their parents were not well educated. I knew some people lived in not very nice houses. They tended to be less well behaved. They tended not to really appreciate naturally the value of education. They tended to not be as nice to the teachers. And as a result of that, I saw that the teachers weren't very nice to them. And I remember when I was a student, I thought, this is a terrible thing. I thought, and I still do think, that schools and teachers should work to make society better. But I felt like what I was seeing was schools and teachers basically reproducing the status quo, keeping everything the same, keeping the poor students uneducated because they would get suspended more often, they would fail, they could not get ahead through education. So the reason that I wanted to be a teacher was to change that situation. And I thought, I would be nicer and fairer to all the students and not just favor the students who were already lucky and who were already good at doing their schoolwork. I thought I will, really do education the way that I think it's supposed to be done. However, once I started actually studying education more deeply and I was preparing to be a teacher and I was doing some teaching practice in schools for the first time, I realized that teachers are not always in a very good place to make these positive changes. So it's easy for someone from the outside to say, these teachers should be doing something differently. Especially, I think you can think about this when it comes to the COVID pandemic today. All these people have opinions. Well, teachers should be doing this, teachers should be doing that. And what I realized is that there's a lot of pressures on teachers. They are very overworked for the most part. And most people who go into teaching, they do have some spark or something they want to achieve. They do have some moral goal or what some people call like a teaching philosophy, some kind of guiding view. It could be from religion or morality about how to be a good teacher. But they have to compromise themselves because of the high workload and that they don't get to decide the values that go into their teaching. So what happens is that there's other values which schools have, which are related to the values of the government and society. So these values will be that there has to be good test scores. So every student needs to be tested. We need to test the students to make sure that the students are achieving, to make sure that the schools are doing their job. So this is evaluation of efficiency. The focus on testing in a society like Hong Kong shows that there's a value on competition. And I would say even with the idea that higher performing schools are going to get more money than lower performing schools, we see this across society, and it really shows a value of competition. To me, that's like the opposite of providing equal resources to all students. So once I started thinking more deeply about education, I realized I'm really interested in the philosophical values that are informing what schools do and what governments do. And I would really like to, it's very difficult to contribute at the social level, but I would like to be part of a broader social debate, which unfortunately teachers tend to be too busy to be that involved with, about, okay, what are we really doing here in schools? What do we really want schools to do in relation to the rest of society? So I discovered philosophy of education, I think probably at the end of my bachelor's degree or the beginning of my master's study. And I just fell in love with that field and have been interested in it ever since.
That's really interesting. So what you basically describe is there is a vicious cycle that has to be somehow be broken in order to actually make it more equal, especially also in order to foster some equity in some sense. Now, one thing I find very interesting is the fact that I just basically did my stage also when I did my degree, and I really have to say that I never did something that is so hard and so demanding as teaching. I did a lot of different things in my life, but it's really true.
Mm.
It really takes so much energy, incredible energy, um, teaching itself. Now, I just want to pick up on one of your things that you mentioned. You said competition, and that's also very difficult to some extent to understand. Now, for example, from a sport perspective, competition, and saw it in myself, in my own experiences, can be very extremely vital. So it's really hard to address those two needs, especially given the fact that some people might have been fortunate to grow up in a nourishing environment where maybe competition might be something that is vital to the development, whereas to others it might not. Can you just a little bit further explain this competition? Because to me, it seems at least that to some extent we need a little bit competition for people to do anything at all.
Yeah, it's a tough question. So I guess as a philosopher, I don't want to say that one thing is I mean, actually, there are certain things that I will say are completely bad, but a lot of things, it's not a case that one thing is bad and one is good, but that they're sort of competing values in this context. So I'm thinking of myself. I tend to be a pretty competitive person myself, and that's probably part of why I like living in Hong Kong, is it's a very competitive environment for people from kindergarten upward. So the higher education marketplace is competitive, and here it's extremely competitive to get into school. So people take preschool so that they come into kindergarten. Babies, 4 and 5-year-olds apply to preschools and kindergartens with their own CVs and resumes. So I think that's a bit overkill personally, coming from America, which is not that competitive. But what interests me in some of these debates is that there is a challenge here, and there is a direct conflict between the priorities of, on the one hand, competition, and behind competition, there's this idea of a fair playing field, and that people will do better under pressure, and that you need to make it worthwhile for people to be driven and motivate people, and this will motivate people to be more creative. So you have this on the one hand when it comes to competition. However, if we do value something like equality, then it will possibly conflict with competition, because we're never quite sure as a society. It's an open debate in all societies is what equality really means and looks like. If it means a level playing field, so people talk about a level playing field, and people talk about it, there just isn't a level playing field. And People do a lot of very sophisticated research that shows that if a teacher teaches in a certain way, it's going to make a big impact. But none of these studies really deny the fact that a child with more resources, and you can think about resources in terms of parents, education, parents' time and well-being, the household environments, these sorts of factors, it always plays a role. So there's no such thing as a level playing field. So people talk about, okay, in the school, we're going to treat everyone the same. So that is, I mean, that's certainly something to aspire for. From another perspective, equality might mean equality of outcomes. And at the society level, I think we see in the United States and Hong Kong, across societies, there are debates about how much welfare there should be. Should everyone have access to the same quality of healthcare? What does it mean if some people are billionaires and other people can barely afford to pay their rent? What does that mean? So we are debating these things as a society. So as a philosopher of education, I'm interested in how those really big society debates sort of filter down into education debates. So it's not that competition is a bad thing. It's more that if we don't just care about equality, but there is sort of a competing value, and there is a point where they pressure each other. So we also find this with freedom and standardization or regulation or security. And we can't have absolute freedom, but we also can't have absolute control and regulation and security. So there's a tension there in the middle. So as a philosopher, I try to identify what is that tension and how we're actually talking about values we hold, which are very sort of deep underneath the surface. We think we're debating something like a school lunch, but we're actually debating something a bit deeper than that. So that's what I like to do as a philosopher.
Why and how does the philosophy of education matter in the past and presently, for example?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's one that we have to grapple with more and more since higher education itself is becoming more competitive. And there's such an emphasis now on technology and political economy. So we see like the field of philosophy, for example, is getting a lot of stress. And it's actually something that philosophers of education also debate quite a bit, is how it matters. So I've always taken the view that philosophy of education needs to be connected to society debates. There are some philosophers of education who are just looking at what John Dewey said 100 years ago about education, and they're happy to stick with that. For me, I'm very interested in talking about how ideas are very important to the decisions that we make in the education arena. In terms of the work that I do. So people do philosophy of education for many reasons, but for me, one of the goals of philosophy of education is to better understand what education is doing at that sort of underneath the level, underneath the surface level that I mentioned before, and to evaluate whether or not it's doing what we want it to be doing. And here's where I mentioned these sort of competing values that are under the surface. So one of my research areas has been to look at how multiculturalism and diversity is explored in education. So across societies, one of the goals that people have for education, if you look up the website for any education system anywhere in the world, one of the goals will be to help young people appreciate diversity, understand that people are different from them in society, and get along with those people, tolerate them to some extent, to work together with different people. That's a goal everywhere. So what I find in reality is if you look at the textbooks that are trying to help young people do that, and some of the practices of teachers, it doesn't always work in that direction. Actually, you often find stereotypes about ethnic and racial minorities and religious minorities. So in place of a sophisticated understanding of what diversity is, it tends to be very simplified in a way that can actually go against the original goal. There was a case here in Hong Kong where students were asked to match, if you're a sushi chef, then you're from Japan. And if you are a security guard, then you're from Pakistan. And the people who wrote the textbook said, we're helping young people understand there's diversity in society. But from another perspective, if you're from Pakistan or from Japan, you're thinking this doesn't represent anything about the diversity of me or who I am. So here we see this mismatch of what I'd say is like the ideal goal versus the reality. And there are reasons for that. And it's not that people are evil or, you know, taking a specifically wrong approach. But I'm interested in evaluating that from a moral or ethical perspective. So for me, why philosophy of education matters is if we look at this example of teaching that a security guard is from Pakistan or something like this, you can't understand if that's a good or bad thing by using science. You can't use biology. Like biology would make no sense here. Psychology is not really relevant here. Economics isn't relevant here. If we want to say, do we think what we're doing is right or wrong from a moral view or from an ethical view? Is what we're doing in alignment with our values? Is it actually in alignment with another kind of value? So I would say there's another value here of efficiency. So education has to make things simple in order to be efficient because there's not enough time to do all of the things they want to do in a deep way. So we say we're doing one thing, but we're actually doing something else here. Only philosophy of education is equipped to evaluate, is this the right thing to do? Is it a good thing to do? Psychologists can study how do young people receive the messages and what do they think about them? Psychologists can evaluate that, but psychologists don't look at the question as, is this a good thing? Is this the society and the schooling and the lessons that we want young people to receive that are good lessons, or are they bad lessons? So I talk about this in terms of morality, in terms of, are these good things or bad things? You can also think about it in terms of social justice, fairness, or from other perspectives. There are people who would use like a economic theoretical perspective who might evaluate these things from a different way than I would. But I think the reason philosophy of education matters is it answers the question, what should we do? Not what can we do? That's also an important question, or how can we do something? Those are also important questions, which a philosopher of education could say something interesting about from a philosophical view. But philosophers of education are really uniquely equipped to say, should we do this? What are the reasons why we would do this in terms of our goals, which are sort of deeply held goals rather than surface level goals?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point what you're making. I think that's, life is really always like this tension, let's say, like this intra conflict that we have, in between, between kind of what ought we do, like the realm of value, and then there is like the reality, how we act. And it's like, drinking a Coke, right? It might not be very healthy, but, from this standpoint, but on the other hand, I kind of like it. So I kind of break the rules. The second thing that I just wanted to touch is this when you have this tension of, as you just mentioned, I think that's so important that we don't stereotype people, like, because it's really not what we want to do, especially from a philosophical question, in education. But then also on the other hand, there's always like this difficulty of practicality, right? So then we have sometimes this paradox too, where we encounter, where we almost say, well, the exception disproves the rule. And so then it becomes very, very complicated for, let's say, a government or policymakers to actually, do some policies, in order to help as much people as possible in a society. So it's really they are, I feel like, in a very tough decision. So that's why it's so important that where you basically come in and try to give important information in order to actually kind of just pay attention that, well, it can be very harmful, especially for minorities.
Yeah, exactly. And these are really contentious topics today in society at large. So I know the United States government and British government have had real high level, national level debates around, is there still racism in society? And how should educators respond depending on the answer to that question? And they're very sensitive topics because people think, well, I'm not racist, so there's no racism in society. On the other hand, certain types of research points to certain groups might have lower test scores than other groups. I mean, we find this that women and girls have historically tended to perform less well than boys, historically, not necessarily today. So people will look at this and say, this is hard data that justifies a bias. Even with multicultural education, this is a problem. A teacher could say, most of the security guards are from Pakistan. So I'm not lying here. I'm not saying anything that's not true, and I'm trying to reflect the reality. From another perspective, as a philosopher, I think about everything that we're doing is educating young people, and we don't always think about that side of it. So if we want the society to not look the same in the future as it has in the past, then we need, as teachers and educators, to not just think about, what is reality today, but think about what would be better and the problems that are faced today, and recognizing, so for example, if a young person is a minority, to not pressure them from being a really good performer. And teachers will do this for a number of reasons. They'll think, I don't want to stress out this student. This student doesn't share the values of competitiveness. They come from an ethnic minority culture that doesn't value this kind of performance. So I'm just going to let them be, or it's very unlikely that this girl is going to become a scientist. So I'm just going to let her be. Everything suggests the girl says she hates science herself. Most girls aren't in science. So we'll just keep things going the way they're going. Young people are learning from that actively. And so that's why there is a tension between having a vision of a society where really anyone can do anything. That does look different than the society we have today. And I hate to suggest that I'm blaming teachers or like it's teachers' fault or teachers' problem. I'm interested in thinking about how teachers are part of society. Schools are part of society. They're not operating outside of that society, yet they still have a goal to enable us to think about progress and the future and what a better future looks like. And there are many ways that they're hindered in that goal. So there's a lot of interesting things to think about there that keep me busy and up late at night thinking about these topics.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing this. I mean, as you just mentioned, there is also this danger of confirmation bias and so many variables that actually come into play. So it's a really tough situation. On the other hand, it's also really hard for teachers sometimes then to. I think one of the most important things is maybe that they try to at least present information or facts in a way that is non-judgmental. I think that's also very important. But I guess it's also I think it's really hard, to do so.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So we value a sort of neutrality in education, but it's very difficult in reality because we're all people and very few of us are totally neutral about anything, even while we might appreciate the value of neutrality. So there's a lot of interesting things that teachers face there. And I like to think, I hope that one of the indirect outcomes of a lot of the research I do is to really point out that what educators do is so important and they're not really recognized the way that they should be. And this is something that people have been discussing since the COVID pandemic. Who's essential? Teachers are essential. Mailmen are essential. Certain groups of people are truly essential. And some people say we appreciate teachers so much more. So I hope that what research I do is not just sort of attacking them or saying they're doing a bad job, but also saying they're doing actually such important work, the most important work of developing the next generation. They have been thinking about how to be neutral, how to be fair. They think about these things every day and work in a very imperfect environment, and they do their best. So we should really treat them like experts, give them authority, let them contribute to discussions about education system as fair players. School teachers know more than most politicians do about what would make schools a better place. They should be listened to, and we should probably pay them a lot more and give them a little more time off. But maybe that's too utopian.
How does educational philosophy then matter in the future?
So that's a great question. And it's something that philosophers of education are actively thinking about these days, actually, in terms of the role of the field and how it can contribute to progress and development in societies. A number of philosophers of education consider specifically how philosophy can help us think in a more utopian and open-minded way. So this can be something we think about as social thinkers, as educators, as citizens of our societies. We can also think about this in terms of teaching young people in a more philosophically grounded way. So if we teach philosophy in schools, this can also empower young people to be more creative about problems they will face. I think the major reason why philosophy matters is that it's important to both think below the surface, beneath the surface, like I was saying before. What are our deeply held feelings and values? Let's actually look at those. But let's also look beyond our current status quo and think about what is possible in the future. So I was giving a lecture yesterday, and I was discussing to a group of students that you can think about the values of humility and vulnerability, and emphasize these as, so with vulnerability, you can think about this as a bad thing, but it's only because some people are vulnerable and others are not vulnerable. So I made the suggestion that ideally it would be the presidents of societies, the professors in the university, the president of the university. These people should have more humility and be more vulnerable and more open-minded. And the students said a comment which I get often when I'm talking about these things. They say, well, that's really nice, but that's not reality. And students often say, you know, that's really nice, but that's not possible, or that's not reality. And to me, it's really important that we start discussing ideas, because if we're not discussing something, there's no way it can become reality. We need to first think about, what do we want to see happen? We can identify a lot of problems with our world today. So my students often say, okay, the government should do X, Y, and Z. So that's the first step, is we have to think, what would make the world a better place? How can we resolve the challenges we face? We have to first imagine that before we can think through, okay, how can we get to from where we are today to that better space? And I think philosophy is very important there, because a lot of fields just accept the status quo and assume that things are the way they are. Philosophy helps us think about, why are things the way they are? They don't have to be this way. They didn't used to be this way, and they will not be this way in the future. So it'd be really foolish in that context to not think about our deeply held values and what a better future would look like.
I think this is so an important point, especially as an academic, and I can tell that you kind of try to live that, to basically not just preach what or how the world ought to be, but also that you actually are, to some extent, the change that you basically want to see in the world, as Gandhi so nicely put it. Now, to conclude, Liz, your favorite author or book?
It's a good question. So I have my old favorite, which is the philosopher I discovered in graduate school. I've always been very interested in the work of Immanuel Kant. I think he still has a lot of things to say about the debates we're having today about freedom, academic freedom, how to have a dialogue, democracy. A lot of people would say he's a little out of date. I also spent a lot of time thinking about things that Aristotle has discussed when it comes to virtues and values, and more contemporary thinkers. Michel Foucault has some very confusing and thought-provoking things to say, which really I love to think about more deeply. Today, I also have some sort of heroes and people that I spend a lot of time reading today, would be Megan Bowler, Nell Noddings, Christian Christensen, and Michael Hands. Those are all more contemporary philosophers of education who have really inspired me in the work that I do.
Your wishes for the future.
Yeah, so I think I probably share the wishes of a lot of people around the world at the moment. I hope the world can be more peaceful, more fair and just, more safe and more healthy. I've been living in Hong Kong for almost 10 years, and I'm originally from the United States. So both these societies have been very tumultuous for the last few years. So I have a mixed really hope for there to just be more flourishing and more wellness in both places. And some of the recent work I've done has focused on what is well-being and resilience, because they've had a lot of they've been like trending ideas lately, and all across societies we say people need more resilience, people need more well-being. I'm cautious in this context that governments, again, they're trying to use schools to solve the problem, but the problem didn't start with schools. The problem isn't the fault of schools. These are massive issues society is facing. And in order to enhance well-being and resilience, we need political and social solutions and not just educational solutions. But the one thing that makes me feel hopeful in this context is that we do see that every new generation has learned from the past. I feel like the young people today are more creative, more compassionate, more open-minded, and more intelligent than the people who came before. So I just hope that we help them to, become part of society and start contributing to it, because the values of sustainability and well-being and fairness and justice seem to be really deeply felt by a lot of young people. So I hope that their wishes and all of our wishes can be better realized in the future.
Liz, it has really been great to have you, and we really hope that you at some point you will be back and talking about academic freedoms and all these very pressing and issues that we face now and in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you too, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Liz Jackson.